What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. I want to start out this video by first of all saying thank you all, everybody who's tuned in and watched my video from North Dakota State at South Dakota State. That was an incredible environment, incredible experience. Not the most incredible game, but overall such a blast to go to that game and be able to see all you guys in the comments who are obviously either North Dakota State fans or South Dakota State fans. So thank you for tuning in. Hoping to get maybe more content like that. I'm certainly going to be trying to devote a little bit more time to talk about the FCS on this channel if my regular work, being a sports editor at the Council Bluffs Nonpareil, allows for it. But before I get into things in this video, if you go on to enjoy this video and want to see more like it, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. In this video, I'm going to be going over kind of breaking down the Week 9 action in the SEC because there's a huge storyline that just broke. I had filmed the first segment of this video, recorded it, and was going to record a bit more, and some big news broke, so I'm starting it all from scratch, going over that big news. I'll also have videos on the Big Ten and then kind of the rest of college football. So kind of 3 videos, hopefully. If not, I'll throw it all together into one, but you guys know the drill from here. Let's get right into it. So out of the SEC this week, the huge storyline, this is the leading storyline in college football now, as of Sunday evening while I record this, Brian Kelly was dismissed or fired by LSU. Disappointing season so far. The offensive issues have been well documented, and things kind of came crumbling down on Saturday in Baton Rouge, in Death Valley. It was a huge third quarter for Texas A&M. The Tigers led 18-14 at halftime, but Texas A&M won the third quarter 21-0 to lead the Aggies past LSU on the way to a 49-25 rout in Death Valley. Marcel Reed overcame 2 interceptions in the game and ended up with 4 total touchdowns, 310 total yards, and the Texas A&M defense was dominant. They were all over the field, 7 sacks, 11 tackles for loss, and 5 pass deflections. Cassius Howell led the way with 2 sacks. He's now up to 10, which is one of the best marks in college football. For LSU moving forward, Brian Kelly is no longer going to be the head coach, and there's plenty of LSU fans who are happy about that. I think it's a bit of kind of more evidence of where college football is at, especially in this season. The coaching carousel has been crazy. Teams seem really quick to move on. Florida kind of made sense. They had been struggling under Billy Napier, right, just under 500, but Penn State and LSU were kind of surprises. You know, Oklahoma State, Arkansas, Virginia Tech, those other coaching changes made a little bit more sense. This one is a little bit, it makes sense in the context of this season, but if you would have said going into the season that these coaches would be fired in season for having, 3 losses, I would have said you were a bit crazy maybe, or that is ridiculous. That's pulling the trigger pretty quickly, but it is so much about winning and winning often at programs like this and winning the big games, which is something that Brian Kelly did not do at LSU. Neither did James Franklin at Penn State. And ultimately that's why these teams are moving on. Speaking of moving on to the rest of the SEC, this was going to be my leading story. Ole Miss defense kind of proved itself in a 34-26 win over Oklahoma in Norman. Sunterin Perkins had a good game. Something that I noticed, though, too, and that I kind of saw while watching the game, especially making that play that he made late in the game. It was almost called a strip sack. It came back, was called an incomplete pass, but he got to John Mateer, forced an incompletion there, and he's been a disruptor. He doesn't have the same numbers that he had last year, but they talked about on the broadcast that he's just making an impact in different ways, and I kind of saw that just watching that game. They held the Sooners to 10 first-half points, the Rebels' defense did, and they held them scoreless in the fourth quarter. That's, a Rebels defense. The reason I say they proved themselves is because against LSU, it's like, okay, yeah, they held them under 20, but how good is LSU's offense, really? They played well defensively against Tulane as well. There's that gap in competition, but Tulane has stepped up and beaten 2 other Power 4 programs. So I think that is a little bit more, that was kind of a sign that this defense can play pretty well. But they had struggled against Arkansas and Georgia. Now, for Ole Miss, we're going to have to keep an eye on them because this is not like the end of the line or anything like that. Their schedule is pretty easy the rest of the way. I think at this point, with a win in this game, Ole Miss, barring a shocking upset or two, is pretty much a lock for the college football playoff. Something else for them, their offense looks really good. Trinidad Chambliss over 360 total yards. Kawan Lacey, 70 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. And then, again, kind of a storyline to watch for this team is their ability to get like a different receiver to make a big impact in every game. This time it was Winston Watkins, who had 111 receiving yards. The Rebels now have 8 receivers or players, because Lacey is one of these players, with over 100 receiving yards. They don't have a single player that has over 500, so they don't have a single like star, but they have a really good group of guys who can catch the ball. And so that's something to watch for Ole Miss. Again, we'll kind of see how that looks in the playoff as well. I think their offense is definitely clicking. I don't think that's as much of a question. You know, they had some issues here and there. I think of that Washington State game. You know, that's kind of a sleepy start time, though. So how much of that is down to the surrounding circumstances versus offensive issues? I think Ole Miss is looking good. How their defense holds up, though, they're going to, you know, they have been playing on the better side of things, but they still have those games where they kind of struggled. So keep an eye on the Rebels and how they do in that area. Next up, Vanderbilt continues their best start since 1941, shuts down Ahmad Hardy and Missouri in a 17-10 win. Diego Pavia got the go-ahead rushing touchdown with 1:52 left in the fourth. He had not his best game for sure, 10 for 19, 129 yards, threw an interception, and then also rushed for 20 yards and a touchdown. But the Commodores' defense played a really good game overall. They didn't put up a lot of big numbers. They only had 1 sack, 4 tackles for loss, but they made those key stops in this game, and that was huge, holding the Tigers to 10 points. Bo Pribula, the Mizzou quarterback, went out with an injury. Matt Zollers came in, played a pretty good game in relief of Pribula, 14 for 23, 138 yards, and a touchdown. But overall, it's a big win for the Commodores, and I'll talk about it here in a little bit when I kind of go over the hierarchy, but they still have some key games to get, but if they can split those 2 meetings that I'll talk about, the Commodores will be a lock for the college football playoff. Finally, in terms of the games that happened this past week, Alabama and Texas both rally from fourth quarter deficits on the road. Alabama at South Carolina, Texas at Mississippi State. We'll start with the Crimson Tide. They were down 22-14, go on a 14-play, 79-yard drive that ate up 7 minutes and 44 seconds of game time. And then Deontay Lawson gets to Lenora Sellers, forces a strip sack, and Tim Keenan III is there for the recovery. Jeremy Bernard quickly scores a 25-yard go-ahead touchdown, and Alabama survives in Columbia. Ty Simpson, again, a really efficient game passing the ball, over 250 yards and 2 touchdowns for the 6th time this season. 6th time he's passed for over 250 yards and 2 touchdowns, and in every single game that he's played in, all 8 of Alabama's games, he's thrown for over 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. So he's certainly in the Heisman discussion. I'll talk about in my Big Ten video, though, who I think is the Heisman favorite. But overall, 29-22 comeback win for the Crimson Tide, who continue to look like probably that second team. They're right there with Texas A&M. Texas A&M, I'll give the benefit of the doubt for that win over Notre Dame and being undefeated, but Alabama is right on their heels right now, and I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. For Texas, the Longhorns' offense was anemic through the first 3 quarters. They were trailing 31-14 heading into the fourth quarter, but then kind of here's how it unfolded. 5 plays, 80-yard touchdown drive. Mississippi State goes down and scores a touchdown and keeps the lead at 17. But then Texas goes 75 yards on 9 plays, scores a touchdown. Then on the ensuing drive for Mississippi State, Anthony Hill Jr. gets a big sack. Texas then goes down 12 plays, 53 yards, and a field goal. Mississippi State 3 and out, punts the ball, and then kind of the emerging star, kind of a under-the-radar star for Texas, Ryan Niblett, for the second time this season, returns a punt over 75 yards. He goes 79 yards for a punt return touchdown to tie the score at 38. Forced a punt to end regulation, and then Texas backup quarterback Matthew Caldwell throws the go-ahead touchdown pass in overtime, and I think it was Ethan Burke had a forced fumble to end the game and give Texas a 45-38 win in overtime. Now, kind of wrapping things up, going over what I think is the SEC hierarchy. I've got A&M, the top dog right now in the SEC. They're 8-0, 5-0 in conference. Their remaining games at Missouri, home against South Carolina, at Texas. So two big ones, but as long as they don't lose all three, Texas is going to be in the playoff. And then as long as they don't lose, the cupcake game that they have on their schedule as well, which I think is Samford, which tripped up, I think it was Kirk Herbstreit on that broadcast, funny enough. Alabama is my number 2 team in the SEC, 7-1, 5-0 in conference as well. They're home against LSU, who is going to be reeling after firing Brian Kelly. Maybe they'll be fired up and motivated, but I think that team, kind of with that third loss, this is kind of a lost season now. 3 losses possible for the playoff, but not with how many teams there are in the SEC with 2 losses. Home against Oklahoma for the Tide as well, then Eastern Illinois, and then at Auburn. I think both of those 2 teams are virtually a lock to meet. I could see Texas maybe beating Texas A&M, but then I'm not sure how the tiebreakers would work if there ended up being more than just those 2 teams as 1-loss teams. Georgia is my number 3, really kind of down to having that head-to-head over Ole Miss. They're 6-1, 4-1. They have that neutral site game against Florida in Jacksonville, then at Mississippi State, home against Texas, and then a big one in non-conference that I'm really looking forward to, Georgia against Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Now, that one could have college football playoff implications if the Dogs were to lose to either, a shocker against Florida or Mississippi State or against Texas. That's a key game too, Georgia, Texas. That could be huge. Ole Miss is next up to me, 7-1, 4-1 in conference. They're home against South Carolina, home against Florida, and at Mississippi State. Again, Mississippi State's that Egg Bowl. Got to be careful against South Carolina and Florida, but the fact that those are at home in Oxford are going to be big for them. I think the Rebels are in a good position, and if Texas A&M or Alabama trips up, they, I think, will be the most likely team, them or Georgia, they'll be the most likely teams to be waiting kind of in the wings to get in instead. Vanderbilt then, 7-1, 3-1 in conference. They've got 4 conference games left, and there's 2 big ones. They're at Texas this week, which to me is a college football playoff elimination game. I know Vanderbilt's been really good this year, and they might have a chance if they were to beat Tennessee in the regular season finale, but 2 losses for the Commodores would be a big blow. They do host Auburn and Kentucky. Between those games against the 2 UT schools, Texas and Tennessee, those 2 fan bases can argue out in the comments which one is the true UT. But that's the outlook for Vandy. I think they probably can split. And I know I kind of made it sound like maybe if they lose, who knows, but I think they could probably split. Then Texas. Texas basically has a 3-game playoff play-in run to end the regular season. They're going to get Arkansas at home in the penultimate game of the season, but they're also going to have Vanderbilt at home. That one's coming up this next week. I'm going to obviously be previewing that game later this week. At number 5, Georgia. Again, mentioned that game earlier. That one's huge. And then home against Texas A&M. I think it goes without saying, with 2 losses, Texas can't afford to lose again. If they run the table, though, they might not only have a chance to have 2 losses and make the college football playoff, but the fact that one of those wins would be over Texas A&M means they probably hold that tiebreaker and are probably in the SEC championship game. So don't count out Texas yet, but this run can end just as quickly as it gets going if they were to lose one of these games against Vanderbilt or Georgia. Three other teams that are kind of in the running, all in the top 20, which I think is a little bit showing the SEC bias. I think if you're going to rank these teams here, some of those the 2-loss Big Ten teams should be here. I'll maybe talk about that when I go over the Big Ten. But you got Tennessee, Missouri, and Oklahoma. All 3 of those teams are 6-2. All 3 of them play at least 1 game against these other 6 teams that are ahead of them. So a chance to kind of move up. And if chaos ensues and either Alabama or A&M lose 2 conference games, those teams could have a chance. But really, for those 3 teams, it's more, can you get into the playoffs? That's the big question there. Mizzou, their schedule is pretty weak. They've got that chance hosting A&M. That's their one chance. Outside of that, though, if they win that, then they're really back in this picture. Vandy, Tennessee to wrap up the regular season is going to be awesome. Potentially a college football playoff playing game. And then Oklahoma at Alabama, and I think they play LSU. I can't remember now if they're at home or away in that one, but Sooners have a shot to bounce back and stay in that discussion. But that's kind of the outlook of the SEC. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the SEC conference, and stay tuned for my videos this coming week previewing the conference games this coming week. Diving into the Big Ten breakdown of Week 9, my number one observation is that Fernando Mendoza is, I think, the Heisman favorite. Now, he didn't put up an incredible stat line against UCLA, 213 total yards, 4 total touchdowns, but he's led this Hoosiers team incredibly on offense. You look at some of the guys he has around him, yes, especially Elijah Surratt at wide receiver, some of the running backs that he has as well, but he has led this offense and this team to incredible heights. Curt Cignetti, I think, is probably the favorite for Coach of the Year, again, considering that, yeah, that team last year was really special, but a lot of people maybe thought it could be a one-hit wonder, honestly, myself included, but he's proven that it's not the case, and Indiana's looking really good. Aiden Fisher with a pick six early in that game against UCLA kind of set the tone. The Hoosiers had 3 takeaways in that game, 2 picks and a fumble. Looking up ahead for the Hoosiers, at Maryland, at Penn State, both of those games are kind of trap games, but games they should win. Home against Wisconsin and at Purdue. I mean, the path is clear. I'll talk about it maybe a little bit later on in this video, but Hoosiers are looking really good, and there's really only one team in the Big Ten that compares to them, I think, especially because they have that win over Oregon. It's obviously Ohio State. But speaking of those Ducks, the conditions weren't great. I'll give them that, but the Oregon offense was pretty lackluster in a 21-7 win over Wisconsin. I mean, this is a Wisconsin team that gave up 34 to Ohio State and 37 to Iowa. And yes, the Hawkeyes are finding their offensive groove. They did it again this week. I'll talk about that in a second. But Oregon, 335 total yards isn't terrible, but only 132 passing. Now, yes, a lot of that's probably down to the weather, but they struggled to score still. Even when the weather is, rainy and kind of crappy, you could still find ways to score, and they kind of struggled. And they've got kind of a sneaky tough schedule to finish the season. They're at Iowa, who's 6-2, home against Minnesota, who's 5-3, home against number 23 USC, who's 5-2, and at Washington. Boy, oh boy, that rivalry game in the final week of the regular season against those Huskies in Seattle could be huge. I'll talk about that in a little bit later on too. Iowa stomps Minnesota to claim the Floyd of Rosedale. Their offense is starting to click. I saw South Dakota State this past week. They look like they could use Mark Gronowski back in those colors in Brookings, but he looked a lot better this past week. Their defense played well also, as they pretty much kind of took care of business and rolled to a win over Minnesota. Then talking about Washington, their offense kind of reawakened against Illinois in a 42-25 win. Big game for Denzel Boston. He had 153 receiving yards and a touchdown, and he also threw a passing touchdown. A little bit of trickery for the Huskies offense. Damon Williams as well. Wow. I mean, he got shut down a bit against Michigan. There were a little bit of questions that started to arise, kind of like Ohio State. I think that just shows the gap in class maybe between Washington and those teams. I think Washington does compare a lot better to teams like Illinois and some of these other teams that are kind of in that second tier of the Big Ten. Williams was 26 for 33, 280 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 66 rushing yards to bring his total to 346 total in the game. The Huskies, they're at Wisconsin, home against Purdue, at UCLA. 2 of those games are kind of trap games, and you don't want to just overlook any opponent, even the Boilermakers coming into town, but the Huskies should be 9-2. And I think I see potential in Oregon losing one of those games to Iowa or USC, but I would expect them not to. I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised at all if they lose. There's some upsets that I'm surprised by. Those would not be one of them. There's a good chance, though, that Oregon and Washington meet at Oregon 1 loss, Washington 2 losses, and with potentially a college football playoff bid on the line. And if Oregon loses to Iowa or USC, that could be two loss teams. That is straight up a play-in game. That will be like a who's going to get the Big Ten's 3rd or 4th bid. That is an exciting game to keep an eye on. Finally, in terms of the games that happened before I go over the conference hierarchy, Justice Haynes, 150 rushing yards in a 31-20 win over Michigan State for the Michigan Wolverines. Now, going over this hierarchy, Ohio State and Indiana are 1A and 1B. I would probably favor the Buckeyes slightly, but right now, the way Indiana's playing, I don't think that is a gimme for Ohio State in a likely Big Ten championship meeting. Ohio State's going to host Penn State, at Purdue, home against UCLA, home against Rutgers, and at Michigan. That is very similar, although I think the Buckeyes probably go into that one with an undefeated record most likely. That game against Michigan is going to be huge because I think Michigan could be in a similar position. Talking about those Wolverines, I have them a little bit lower down in these Big Ten rankings, but they're 6-2, 4-1, home against Purdue, at Northwestern, at Maryland. Those latter two games are both, trap games. Again, Purdue, I feel for the Boilermakers. They're getting like everybody in this top tier of the Big Ten, especially here at the end of the season. But Michigan should have two losses when the Buckeyes come into Ann Arbor, and they're going to be playing, I think, for potentially a spot in the college football playoff. Next up, kind of behind Ohio State and Indiana, though, I have Oregon. They're 7-1, 4-1. Already mentioned that schedule. They have 3 games that they'll be playing teams that are playing for their college football playoff survival. You've got Iowa, and boy, Iowa has kind of 3 games as well. They're going to host Oregon, at USC, and at Nebraska. And then for USC, they're at Nebraska, home against Northwestern, home against Iowa, at Oregon, and home against UCLA. So those 3 teams, Oregon, USC, and Iowa, each of those 3 teams have like 3 games left on their schedule. They all play each other, basically. So it's likely that one of those teams emerges. Obviously, there's also Washington there waiting in the wings. There's Nebraska as well. That game against USC this coming week is going to be big. Even if it doesn't end up getting a team into the playoff for this week at least, one of those teams will stay alive and in contention. The other one will get that third loss and be knocked out. So that's kind of my outlook. I think Ohio State and Indiana are basically on a collision course. Like, honestly, for the Buckeyes, even if they do lose to the Wolverines, they still have a good shot. Though, Michigan going into that game, I guess I don't think they have another loss anywhere. So really, Ohio State probably, if they want to play in the Big Ten championship and if they want to beat their rivals, which I know they do, can't afford to lose that one. So I think, though, it is Ohio State and Indiana. If I had to predict that Ohio State-Michigan game, I do think the Buckeyes win that one, as much as that's bitten me the last 4 years. And then Oregon, USC, Iowa, and Washington, and even Nebraska, those 5 teams will kind of be sorted out. I think Michigan will rise up into kind of maybe that number 3 or 4 status behind Oregon, especially heading into the final week. Oregon and Washington as well, I think, will be a big meeting. And then it's just a matter of if USC or Iowa can keep themselves in that picture as well. But it's kind of sorting time in the Big Ten. We know that, at least like 2 of these teams, I guess 2 or 3, are going to end up with more than 2 losses. So it's going to kind of sort itself out on a week-by-week basis. I'll obviously be previewing these games, so kind of reveal who I think will emerge from that. But Big Ten is really exciting. I think it's kind of up in the picture, and I love that Oregon, USC, and Iowa are all playing each other, and that Nebraska's playing USC, Washington's playing against Oregon. So should be a really fun finish to the season in the Big Ten. Final part of my Week 9 breakdown of college football action, I'm going to be talking about the Big 12, ACC, and Group of 5 picture, kind of bringing those all together. Starting out with the Big 12, BYU overcame a 2-score first half deficit and outscored Iowa State 24-3 in the second half to come away with a 41-27 win. Falea Tau Satuela, hopefully I'm saying that right, got a big pick 6 in this one for the Cougars. Bear Bachmeier with another big game. As long as BYU continues to win, Bachmeier, along with his brother Tiger Bachmeier, and I think Bear is probably in the Heisman discussion. He had over 350 total yards, 300 passing, and almost 50 rushing, and 3 total touchdowns. And for Iowa State, their last gasp college football playoff hopes are over. That's 3 straight losses. Been a rough stretch for Matt Campbell and the Cyclones in Ames, but they will have chances to kind of get back and at least maybe finish with 8 or 9 wins this season, which would be a positive for them. I'll talk more about BYU when I go over kind of the conference hierarchy later on in this video. Texas Tech regained their footing. There's not a whole lot to talk about here. It was a 42-0 stomping of Oklahoma State, and I just feel for the Cowboys. They are probably one of the worst teams in Power 4 college football, which to me kind of stings to see because their quarterback, Zane Flores, who had been dealing with injuries, I think was back this week, was a player who I covered in high school. So obviously when you have a player like that, and I know what a great guy he is, I want to see Oklahoma State get back, and hopefully they will. He's still a young quarterback. That team is going to either hire somebody from within or find somebody out there, and hopefully things will get corrected in Stillwater. Cincinnati wins big at home over Baylor, 41-20. Brendan Sorsby had a really efficient game. Watching it seemed like he had bigger stats than this, but 196 total yards, 3 touchdowns, and then the 2 running backs, two guys who transferred in from bigger Power 4 schools, Tawi Walker, who played at Oklahoma and Wisconsin, and Evan Pryor, who kind of had a cup of coffee at Ohio State. Those 2 guys combined for 150 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And the UC defense also forced 2 fumbles and recovered both in this game. So I'll talk more about the Bearcats' outlook here in a little bit as well. Finally, Houston stuns Arizona State in Tempe, 24-16. Connor Weigman, the Texas A&M transfer quarterback, had 2 rushing touchdowns. The defense did allow Sam Levitt to throw for 270 yards, even without Jordan Tyson, but they got the stops when they needed to. And Eddie Walls III had a huge game with 3 sacks for the Cougars in this one. So looking over the Big 12 hierarchy, to me, it's BYU. They're number 1. They're 8-0, 5-0 in conference. They're going to have games at Texas Tech, home against TCU, at Cincinnati, and then home against UCF, against Central Florida. Those games, the first 3 I mentioned, it's a 7-1 Red Raiders team, 6-2 Horned Frogs, 7-1 Cincinnati, 2 of those on the road. That's a tough slate. They've proven themselves up to this point, but those are probably going to be, to me, the toughest games they've played so far. They had Utah at home and then Iowa State on the road, but I think Texas Tech will be their toughest opponent yet. And the way Cincinnati's playing, that might be their toughest opponent yet too. And TCU is not a team to overlook either. Josh Hoover's a really good quarterback there. Then the Bearcats, 7-1, 5-0 in conference. They've got a big one this week, kind of a sorting type of game at Utah. Then they're home against Arizona, that game against BYU, and at TCU. Horned Frogs are getting everybody. Texas Tech then 7-1, 4-1 in conference. They're at Kansas State, who, shout out the Wildcats. They've kind of rebounded from a rough start this season. They're sitting 4-4. They had a huge dominant rivalry win over Kansas, which I think makes it 17 straight in the Sunflower Showdown. Big win for the Wildcats there. Then Texas Tech also has BYU, and then home games against Central Florida and a road game at West Virginia to finish the season. Houston then is 7-1, also 4-1. They're home against West Virginia, at UCF, home against TCU, and at Baylor. I would say the Cougars, probably out of those teams that I've talked about so far, have the easiest schedule. That game against TCU is important. And speaking of the Horned Frogs, they're kind of right there. Them and Utah, I think, are kind of interchangeable. They're both 6-2 and 3-2 in conference. The Horned Frogs, again, home against Iowa State, at BYU, at Houston, and home against Cincinnati. Boy, that is a gauntlet of a final 3 games in conference. But if they can find a way to win all 3 of those and get help elsewhere, I mean, that would be, if those are the only losses for BYU and Cincinnati, then they wouldn't. But if somebody else beats either BYU or Cincinnati, TCU could still find a way to sneak into the Big 12 championship game. Utah as well, kind of similarly. They're home against Cincinnati, but then their schedule actually really opens up. They're at Baylor, home against Kansas State, and at Kansas. If they can get past Cincinnati, then they're looking at, they're probably hoping for, probably Cincinnati to lose to BYU, and then you could be set up for potentially a holy war in the Big 12 championship game. So that's kind of the outlook there. I might break that down a little bit more when I do my Week 10 preview. So stay tuned for more there. Finally, the final Power 4 conference, the ACC. Georgia Tech crushes the Orange, pun intended, Orange Crush, 41-16. Haynes King with 5 total touchdowns. And then they won the second and third quarters. You talk about the middle 8. In this case, I'm talking about the middle 30. 31-7 for Georgia Tech. It was 3-3 after the first quarter. They ran away with it. Syracuse got a kind of, give me 6 points late, and Georgia Tech also got 7. But dominant win for Yellow Jackets, who still look like the top team in the ACC by kind of a widening margin. Miami routs Stanford. Virginia survives by literal inches on a 2-point conversion attempt in overtime, getting the win in Chapel Hill over North Carolina. Louisville beats Boston College, and then kind of throwing a wrench into the ACC picture in terms of teams that had been undefeated in conference play. Wake Forest upsets SMU 13-12. Looking over the hierarchy here, Georgia Tech to me is the top team. Like I said, they're 8-0, 5-0 in conference. They're at NC State, at Boston College, home against Pitt. Look out for the Panthers. We'll talk about them more a little bit here in a second. And then obviously that huge non-conference game against Georgia. I think Georgia Tech's probably going in that game against Georgia at 11-0, and I think Georgia is probably 10-1 going into that game. So that is a huge game. It might not be a huge game in terms of like significance of making the college football playoff unless one or both of these teams loses a game somewhere that I don't expect them to. But it will be a really good game, one of the best games that we've seen in the clean, old-fashioned hate rivalry in a long time, I guess before last year. But especially in terms of the magnitude around it. You know, Georgia Tech was good last year, but they weren't in the contention for anything. This year, they're a legitimate college football playoff contender and probably the favorite out of the ACC. Anyways, Virginia, with that survival, another week of surviving, they're 7-1, 4-0. They're at Cal, home against Wake Forest, so watch out for the Demon Deacons there. They're the agents of chaos right now. At Duke and home against Virginia Tech. To me, that schedule also sets up for the Cavaliers, though. I mean, Cal and Duke are trap games. Wake Forest has shown they can beat a team on the road, but I think the Cavaliers will be favored in all those. Chandler Morris continues to play really well at quarterback. He did struggle a little bit against North Carolina, but he did what he needed to do to help him to the win. Then Louisville is there. They're 6-1, 3-1. They obviously hold that win over Miami. They're at Virginia Tech, home against Cal, home against Clemson, and at SMU. That game against SMU could, if Virginia were to lose somewhere, that could determine who gets to the ACC championship game because SMU also has one loss in conference. Then you've got Miami, who's at SMU. That one's also big. That'll be kind of a sorting game, you know, now that I think about it. If whichever team wins, Miami or SMU, the loser is probably out of the picture. Even Miami with 2 losses, I think that would drop them further. You know, that loss to Louisville hurts them as well. But then the Hurricanes are also home against Syracuse, home against NC State, at Virginia Tech, and at Pitt. Final week of the regular season this season is starting to really shape up across college football as a really interesting game, an interesting week, especially for games between teams that have like 1 or 2 losses that are trying to find a way to get into the playoff. You know, in the Big Ten, I talked about Oregon against Washington, Ohio State against Michigan, Texas A&M against Texas, potentially, Vanderbilt against Tennessee. There's a lot of games, and this will be one of those too, potentially. Miami against Pitt, because Pitt to get there. Now, for Pitt, it might not be as much to get into the college football playoff, but it could be to get into the ACC championship game because they're at Stanford. They host Notre Dame. The way the Fighting Irish have been playing, they had a bye this past week. I think the Panthers probably lose that one, and then they're at Georgia Tech and home against Miami. But those are tough games. But Pitt has everything in their hands because they only have 1 conference loss. So as long as they avoid what happened to Florida State when they go out to Palo Alto to face the Cardinal and avoid an upset there, doesn't really matter what happens against Notre Dame because I think they'd have to get in automatically. Those games at Georgia Tech and home against Miami, this Pitt team, Pat Narduzzi, you know, it seems like one year they're not so good, but then they'll have a year where they're really good. I think of the season, they had 10 wins and made the ACC championship game, and I'm trying to remember now if it was last year or 2 years ago, but I think it was last year. They started like 6-0 or 7-0 and then finished with like 6 straight losses. So they showed signs of it recently, and they're kind of playing up to that again this year. And then finally Duke as well has 1 loss. So look out for Pitt because they play those important games. A win over Georgia Tech and Miami would, I think, put them into the conference championship game because they'd have the head-to-head over both of those teams. So that's kind of the outlook for the ACC. Finally, the Group of 5 outlook, really kind of focusing on the American Conference because that's where I think the college football playoff bid is going to come from, but it is chaos in the American. Memphis stirred up more of that chaos this past week with a stunning 34-31 win over South Florida. They were down 31-17 going into the 4th, and honestly, I had jotted down while I was watching these games that South Florida, to me, in that moment, looked like 2021 Cincinnati, the team that went in and beat Notre Dame on the road. And to me, how South Florida played against Miami might not be equal to that, but it's fairly comparable how they had played really well in conference. But Memphis decided to throw a wrench into all of that. Brendan Lewis had a really good game, 307 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Defense played really well against the pass, 9 pass deflections in this game. So really, really disruptive in the passing game for Byron Brown, who had played really well up until kind of later in the game as the Bulls were held scoreless. So it's a jumbled mess, and there's a lot of big games to go over in the American. Honestly, this could be its own video. Right now, leading the way is Navy. They're 7-0, 5-0 in conference. They're at North Texas, at Notre Dame, home against South Florida, at Memphis, and home against Army. Each of those teams that I mentioned, they're all in contention. Every game that Navy plays the rest of this season is huge. And even that game against Notre Dame, I wouldn't expect them to win, but boy, if they could pull the upset there, they will be in great territory, and that would knock the Irish out of the playoff contention. Tulane is next, also undefeated in conference at 3-0, 6-1 overall, at UTSA, at Memphis, home against Florida Atlantic, at Temple, who's also kind of in this picture still a little bit, and home against Charlotte. For Memphis, the team that just got that big win over South Florida, they're 7-1, 3-1, holding that tiebreaker in the standings over the Bulls. They're at Rice, home against Tulane, at East Carolina, and home against Navy. So their final 3 games are all against teams that are in this picture. Then you've got South Florida, who's 6-2 overall, 3-1 in conference, home against UTSA, then at Navy, at UAB, and home against Rice. So out of these teams, South Florida has probably the easiest schedule, but right now they already have a loss. There are 2 teams ahead of them that don't have a single loss in conference, including Navy, who's already played 5 conference games. And then they also have that head-to-head tiebreaker against them in comparison to Memphis. Finally, 3 other teams that are also still in the running for the conference. North Texas is 7-1, 3-1. They're the team that's behind South Florida, having lost to the Bulls, obviously. You've got Temple, who is alive in the conference race at 3-1. They're 5-3 overall. And then East Carolina, they still have a lot of conference games to play, and they play some of these teams ahead of them. And even though they're 4-3 overall, they're still in the picture. So the American Conference is going to be a lot of fun to watch over this last month of the college football season. I'm going to be trying to pay a little bit closer attention to it. I know I give a lot of attention to the Big Ten and the SEC and even Big 12 and ACC. But this is a fun race to watch. It'll be exciting to see how things finish up there. But that is all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burtonette. Have a great rest of your day. Stay tuned for my next video. I'll be previewing the Week 10 action across the board. And let me know in the comments below what other type of content you want to see, because you guys seem to respond really well to that North Dakota State, South Dakota State game vlog. But thanks again for watching. I'm Peter, signing out. Peace.